In this video, we're going to talk about classical Greek and Roman art, which is going to be the time period between about 500 BCE and 500 CE, about a 1,000-year period. And we're going to start out by looking at this sculpture here. This is called the Kouros Boy. And the Kouros Boy is a good example of archaic Greek sculpture. And we're going to start out talking about Greek sculpture, and that will give way to Roman culture. So Greece was this thriving artistic community, and then the Roman Empire started growing and growing and growing. And eventually Rome conquered Greece, and they liked all of the statues and artwork and buildings so much that the Romans decided, let's take all of that culture and the way that they've styled everything and make it our own. So we're starting in Greece with the Kouros Boy. And this is somewhat similar to what we looked at in the last video with the statues at Tel Asmar, where he's very stiff, he's standing straight up and down. His arms are starting to come away from his body a little bit. You can start to see that negative space between the arm and the body. The legs are two separate legs now, so there is a separate space between them. If you look really closely, you can see that his ankles have broken and that portion of the statue has had to be filled in and restored. So he wasn't complete, so there has been some repairs done on this, which is why, having the two legs separated, having all of that stone, all of that weight on top of it, they often break. But he's still very stiff. He's standing almost at attention, even though he has one leg moving forward in front of the other. And as time goes on, we're going to see these sculptures get more natural and look more realistic. So the next step after this is the Kritios Boy. The Kritios Boy is another marble sculpture. Obviously, he's missing some arms and legs. He would have been highly pigmented. He would have had paint on his entire body to make him look real. And his eyes are also missing. Usually they would have some kind of shell or precious stone in the eye so you can see it. Those have been stolen or reused in something else at some point. The Kritios Boy looks much more natural, much more relaxed than the Kouros Boy. So going back to the Kouros Boy, very stiff, very formal. This is a little bit more relaxed, and there's a very, very simple tool used here to make him look relaxed. It's called contrapposto. Contrapposto means that his weight is on one leg instead of both. It's often associated with a curve in the spine, like an S-shape curve in the spine. You can see if you look closely, his hips are not quite straight across. They are tilted. They're tilted just slightly where one hip is higher than the other. And what happens when a person stands contrapposto, when you watch someone stand, they kind of shift their weight from one leg to the other. They'll kind of shift back and forth. What you'll notice is if one hip comes up, the opposite shoulder will go down. So if the left hip goes up, the left shoulder will go down, and it creates this kind of curve in the spine. And just that little bit of a twist in the pose will make it look more relaxed and more natural. Taking this to extreme, we have the Doryphoros. The Doryphoros was by an artist named Polykleitos. Polykleitos was trying to create what he thought was the perfect man. He was looking at Olympians, looking at athletes, looking at their bodies, and trying to figure out what would the perfect athlete, the perfect man look like. And you can see this gets really relaxed. All of his weight is on one leg. He really has that other hip is dropped down. The opposite shoulder is also dropped down. So there's a big, much larger twist to the body here. You'll also notice there's this stump in the background, this stump that kind of comes up and connects with his leg. That's so that his ankles wouldn't break. It was a common problem that these statues would be weak at the ankles, and that's where they would break. So adding this stump that kind of holds the statue up creates a tripod, and that makes it much sturdier and less likely to break and fall down. So it's called the Doryphoros, which means the spear bearer. this man would be holding a spear originally. The spear is now missing, so he just has an empty hand, but there should be a spear that goes over his shoulder in that hand, which isn't necessarily for hunting. Very likely that he's supposed to represent an Olympian, an athlete, throwing a spear for sport, the javelin. And now you'll notice that like he is rather muscular. He does have a pretty good physique, but it's not quite as big as we see now when we think of bodybuilders, and professional athletes tend to be much more muscular than this these days. We always have to keep in mind, we have a very high calorie content in our diet. We have the ability to build muscle in ways that they didn't. They didn't have creatine. They didn't have steroids. They didn't have any kind of enhancers. They didn't have Gatorade. They didn't have all the things that we use to help keep our bodies hydrated and to bulk and build muscle. So you wouldn't see people as muscular then as you would see now. You would see people that were very fit because pretty much everyone was doing physical labor, but not in the way that we tend to see in professional athletes and Olympians today. Now you'll see this as sculpture continues, the arm moves even farther away from the body. This cape that's there, this is called the Apollo Belvedere. The Apollo, it's a god, the sun god. So he is supposed to fly across the sky and carry the sun on a chariot. So this Apollo, his arm has moved all the way out, away from his body. It's not a very strong pose. It's not very strong for the marble. It tends to break whenever you get an arm that's far away. So that cape holds that arm up. That's actually the support for the arm. And then on the other side, you have a big stump again, holding him up on the other side. So as this progresses, as sculpture progressed in classical Greek sculpture, this is actually Roman sculpture, it gets to where these poses get more advanced. The body parts are moving farther away from the body. There starts to be a twist in the body. They start to look like they are moving. And in this case, looking like he's starting to float. He really looks like he's about to just lift off of that base. He feels very light. Trying to make marble look light is not very easy. Marble is heavy, it's stone. Having a very light, airy sculpture out of marble is the challenge here. And this would be the extreme. Now this, I do have to make a disclaimer, this may or may not be classical Roman sculpture. So this is a sculpture that was lost for a long time. We knew it existed. I say we. Historians knew it existed. It was written about. People had sketches of it, but the actual sculpture itself was lost. No one knew where it was. It was lost for centuries. Until it was found in the late 1400s. It was found buried in pieces, and they dug it up, and it was restored by an artist named Michelangelo. So in the Renaissance, this sculpture was restored by Michelangelo. And there's things about it that look a lot like Michelangelo's sculpture. So there are theories that maybe this wasn't a classical sculpture and this is actually a fraud, that this was a trick, that Michelangelo made it himself and tried to pass it off as a classical Roman sculpture. Or it could be that this was very inspirational for Michelangelo, that looking at this gave him a lot of his ideas about how to structure the body and how to pose a body. Either way, it's a fantastic sculpture. It's a great example. And when we look at this, we see that pose has gotten really, really extreme. His arms are all over the place. He is twisting. The story here is this is Laocoon. And Laocoon had two sons, and here they are being devoured by a snake. So Laocoon was a prophet, sort of, and a follower of Apollo. He was blinded. Often in Greek mythology, a person who becomes blind can see the future or see things that other people aren't aware of. And he did something to anger the gods. Depending on what story you're reading, it changes what it is that he did. In one story, he was a priest and he took a wife, and that made the gods angry. In one story, he tried to shoot an arrow at the Trojan horse to give away that it had people in it. In any case, he made the gods angry, and they sent a snake, and the snake devoured Laocoon and his sons. So that's what this is a sculpture of. And another thing we're looking at here is his physique. He is very muscular. This is more like what we would see as professional athletes now, being this muscular, a professional weightlifter. But at the time, this was way over the top. Because a lot of the like big bodybuilders that we see now, they are using steroids that were not available then. So this would be like over the top. Like this guy's muscles have muscles. He is made to be godlike, and you can see that he's huge. Like the two boys on either side of him, those are grown men. Those are not children. Those are grown men. So he is a giant. He is huge. So we start to see this elevation of the human figure into something superhuman, something more than human, and kind of this glorified figure. So again, we don't know if this is a Michelangelo original or something that was very inspirational for him. In any case, he has some connection to this sculpture when it was found. And we know there was at least a sculpture very similar to this in ancient classical Rome. There's not a lot of painting that survived from this time period because paintings don't last that long. We do know stories about paintings. There's stories about painting competitions, but the paintings themselves didn't last. This is one example of what a painting in classical Rome would have looked like. This is in a place called Pompeii. Pompeii is unique because it was buried in ash when Mount Vesuvius erupted. And when it was buried in ash, it preserved everything, including murals like this one that are on the walls. So you can actually see how these Roman homes and Roman businesses were decorated. And this is a very, very nice example, really well preserved. I do want to point out a couple of people in this. On the left, we see a man who is rather large, a more rotund man. Like we discussed in the last video, it was not common for a person to be very large, for a person to have excess weight at this time because people didn't have access to that much food. So this is not just a man on the left here. This is a god. His name is Bacchus. He's also called Dionysus, and you can tell because he has a grapevine that goes around his head. And that grapevine is because he's the god of wine. He's the god of wine and music and theater and dancing. They used to have a festival in his honor, the festival for Dionysus. And that festival was just a week of drinking and doing everything that goes with excessive alcohol consumption. But they would also have theater at this festival and music and dancing, all kinds of fun stuff. And this festival went on for a long time until around 500 CE when the festival ended. It was banned. You could no longer celebrate the festival of Dionysus because you could no longer worship him as a god. So theater in general, a lot of art and culture was lost then. But that's who we are seeing represented here. I also want to point out on the right here, you'll see someone that looks a lot like an angel, what we would commonly call an angel. On the right, with the person standing there with the wings, it looks like an angel figure. It's not. It is not an angel. That's actually a person called Nike. Nike, or winged victory, which is a Greek goddess. And Nike is actually what the shoe brand Nike is named after. And the Nike swoosh, the logo, is made to resemble a wing, which is supposed to represent one of Nike's wings. Winged Victory, was a messenger, a goddess, had wings, could fly, and is the image that most angels, the image of an angel is based off of. It appeared here in Greek and Roman artwork before it started to appear in Christian artwork. But because Pompeii wasn't preserved intentionally, it was preserved accidentally. Everything was preserved. Not only this is something that might have been preserved on purpose. People might have wanted to keep. But there was other things like graffiti that was carved on the walls. So this is some graffiti of two gladiators that people had carved into the structure to show their support. This is like my favorite gladiator. People supported gladiators the way people now would support their favorite basketball player or their favorite football player. So here they have two gladiators that they're supporting. A lot of other graffiti was uncovered in Pompeii and continues to be uncovered. They're still excavating there. And we think about the past, the classical past, as being this like romanticized thing, where when you look at sculptures like these, you think of it as this, it seems like a high society, very proper, whatever kind of place. But when you look at the graffiti that was there was a lot of what you would expect junior hires to paint on things if you just give them a bottle of spray paint. I think we all know you give a teenager, a 13-year-old boy, a can of spray paint and tell him, spray paint whatever you want on this building and no one's going to get you in trouble for it. I think we all have some kind of idea what they're going to paint on the building. That's the kind of graffiti that they found in Pompeii. That's all I'm going to say. You can look it up if you want. But there were a lot of paintings on the walls in Pompeii depicting acts. Lots of things. They were doing all kinds of things in Pompeii, and they didn't hide it. They were painting it on the walls. So, moving on. All right, so in architecture, this is the building that all other buildings are compared to. This is the Parthenon. The Parthenon is considered, it's like the gold standard of architecture. It has these long rows of columns. It's kind of hard to see now because a lot of it has fallen apart, but they did find that the back of the building is actually slightly taller than the front because there's this phenomenon called parallax, where the curvature of your eye will actually warp a line. If you draw a straight line really far, it'll warp that line a little bit, kind of like a fisheye lens. Your eye is a lens and it warps everything that you see. You're used to seeing things that way just because it's how you've always seen things. But you might not even notice it. But straight lines, when you look at them, they're not straight. They curve a little bit because of the curvature of your eye. They noticed this. They knew this when they built the Parthenon, and they wanted to make it a straight line going back, that tall roof line going back. They wanted it to be perfectly straight. So they actually built it so that it's a curved line, so that when you're seeing it from this angle from the street, it's straight. It looks straight. So they put a lot of energy and effort into building this. Again, it doesn't look like much now, but this is an exact replica of this building that you can see in Nashville, Tennessee. So if you go to Tennessee, if you go to Nashville, go see the Parthenon. It's a perfect replica, life size, everything pigmented the way it should be. So it's painted, and it's a great example of what this building used to look like. Even on the inside, they have the statue of Athena. Athena is the goddess of war. And so here you see her with a spear and a shield ready to go to war. And so this this building was a temple to Athena, and this was in Athens, Greece. The city is named after Athena. I also want to point out these columns that you see in here. I want you to look at these columns. They're fluted, which means they have these grooves that go up and down in them. That is a fluted column. They are Doric. I know that word probably doesn't mean anything to you, but I'm saying it now and it's going to come up again. They are Doric columns, which means if you look at the tops of them, the capital of them, the top, it's just a plain circle that goes around. There's no decoration at the top. These are Doric columns. And there's a reason for that, and we'll get to that. Now, this is a different building, another very famous building in Rome. This one is in Rome, in Italy. And this is called the Pantheon. The last one was the Parthenon. This is the Pantheon. We've heard that word before. In our last video, we talked about a pantheon. Egypt had a pantheon. Pan meaning many, theo meaning gods. Pantheon means many gods. So this was the temple to the pantheon, temple to many gods. This is not like the Parthenon that is a temple to Athena. This is the pantheon that is a temple to all gods. This is a cutout of the side of this building. And you can see that it's kind of a perfect sphere, can fit inside this building, this perfect ball shape. And it has all of these little alcoves going all around it. This is what it looks like in the inside. It's open at the top there. That's called an oculus. So that light comes in, and it kind of creates this magical effect where the light moves around the space as the sun moves. And you get this, it looks like a giant eyeball, which is why it's called an oculus. It also meant that you could have a fire, like a bonfire, right in the middle of this space, and all of that smoke would go up out that oculus, out the top. Now, this is a very, very large dome. Very large. And so it's hard to make a dome that big out of stone. To make stone in an arch shape, you have to have a keystone. But this doesn't have a keystone. A keystone is the stone that goes in the top and the middle. It's open in the middle. So building this structure out of stacking stone or brick would be impossible. It's too big. It's too big of a dome. What they used was cement. They used Roman cement. And it was strong. It was very strong cement. So if you look at this, you can see this structure in the back is made entirely out of cement. And so this was a new innovation. They were able to make these large structures out of one solid thing, one solid piece of cement, and create things like these giant arches. When the Roman Empire fell, this was lost. The technology of cement was lost. It wasn't passed on. So things like cement, if you were the person that figured out how to make cement, you didn't want people to know. Because if you're the only person that knows how to make it, then if anyone wants a building made out of cement, they have to go to you. But if you tell someone how to make it, well, then there's two people they can go to, and you're in competition with each other and your prices go down. But if you're the only one, well, then you can charge as much as you want. So this technology was kept very hushed. It wasn't shared around. It was kept a secret. And so it would be a very small group of people that would know how to make cement. And as they needed, they could bring more people into that group. And these were masons. Masons are people that work with stone and work with cement and concrete. And so you would have to have a system where you could bring in new masons. You would train the next generation of masons, teach them your secrets, the things that you know, and then they could pass it on to the next generation, but stopping that technology and that information from getting out to everyone. Because if it gets out to everyone, then there's too many people doing it. The market gets oversaturated, and then you can't make any money doing it anymore. So That's kind of the origins of things like the Masons, the Freemasons, was starting with these smaller groups that were needed to protect trade secrets. These were trade secrets. This trade secret was kept so well that when the Roman Empire fell, no, it didn't get passed on to the next generation, and no one knew how to do it. And that technology was lost until the 1700s. So it was lost for about 1,000 years. For about 1,000 years, no one knew how to make a building like this. They looked at it. People were walking by this building every day for 1,000 years thinking, how did they do it? How on earth did they make this? Did they carve it out of one solid piece of stone? How was this done? Even all through the Renaissance, Michelangelo, he would have been there looking at this building thinking, how did they do it? How did they build this dome? So here you can see all of the little alcoves that are empty. The little spaces on the second floor, they are empty spaces. Those would have each had a statue in them of a different god. So this had all of the gods on display in it. It also had a space for unknown god, God not discovered yet. The Roman Empire's pantheon. This is the Roman family of gods. It's a lot to look at. You'll notice that there are many people here, and then you'll also notice that some names show up more than others. One in particular, Jupiter. Jupiter is also Zeus. Jupiter shows up an awful lot in this family tree. You have Jupiter with Ceres, who give birth to Proserpina. You have Jupiter and Juno, Jupiter and Semele, who give birth to Bacchus. Let's see, Jupiter and Latona, Jupiter and Dione, Jupiter and Maya. There's just Jupiter was doing way too much. Jupiter was, he had too many partners and too many kids, but he did give us a lot of gods in the Roman family tree. So, not ideal. All right, coming back to these orders of columns. These are some drawings that were made by a man named Andreas Palladius. And he wrote 4 books on architecture. So while he was alive, a lot of classical Greek and Roman buildings were being torn down. They were in disrepair, they were falling apart, so they decided, let's tear down the ones that are in too bad of shape to save. And Palladio, what he did is he said, before you tear them down, let me make drawings of them. And he made these detailed drawings of all these buildings. So we have a really good idea of what different buildings looked like, even before, even buildings that don't exist anymore. Buildings that have been torn down, we have really good drawings of them. All with scaling and everything, these are perfect drawings. And we see 3 main orders here. On the left, we see Doric. Doric columns, they're fluted. They have grooves along the sides of them. And at the top, they have no decoration. They're just a circle at the top, at the capital. And that is Doric. And that's what we saw in the Temple of Athena, the Doric column. Doric represents strength. Strength, sturdiness, power, which makes sense for the goddess of war to have columns that are Doric columns that represent strength. Next to that, we have what's called Ionic columns. Ionic columns are the ones with the circles at the top. Those circles at the top are actually a scroll, a rolled up scroll. Those are supposed to represent knowledge and literature, reading. So that would have been common for something like a library and a school. Next to that, we have what's called Corinthian columns. They are made out of acanthus leaves. It's a kind of leaf. So the acanthus leaves at the top, it is the higher order, a higher order than Ionic. and it represents beauty and spirituality and love. So you have these three orders: Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and they go in that order. Doric, strength; Ionic, knowledge; Corinthian, beauty. It kind of represents these three different parts of humanity that you're supposed to be developing. They believe that everyone should be well-rounded. They believe that everyone should be developing their body, exercising, building a strong body. Everyone should be developing their mind, reading, gaining knowledge, gaining understanding, learning, teaching, and that everyone should be working on becoming beautiful, working on their spirit, on their soul. That you should be singing songs and writing poetry. And when you get all of those three things combined, you become a complete whole person. But they have an order where one is greater than the next. Doric, strength, is at the bottom. And when you have multiple floors to a building, you can have different columns on each floor. But Doric columns can never be higher in a building than Ionic columns. Ionic columns are always above Doric columns, and Corinthian columns are always above Ionic columns. So you can have a building that the first floor has Doric columns, the second floor has Ionic columns, and the third floor has Corinthian columns. But you can't have a building that has Corinthian columns on the bottom, Doric columns on the second floor, and Ionic columns on the third floor. It makes no sense. So if you ever if you've designed a building that has Ionic columns on the bottom and then Doric columns above that, an architect that knows their history, which architects usually do, would look at it and be like, "This is wrong. You can't. That's wrong. You can't do that." You can also usually tell what kind of building something used to be by looking at the columns. If you see an apartment building, but it has Ionic columns, so you see this a lot in St. Louis, where a building used to be one thing and then it's been repurposed as something else. When you see Ionic columns, you know that building, when it was built, was either a school or a library. When you see Corinthian columns, you know it was either a museum or had something to do with religion or literature or spirituality. When you see Doric columns, that is going to be things like the Armory. The Armory in St. Louis has Doric columns. It's a place where they used to store weapons. I think there's still store weapons there. It has Doric columns because it has to do with war. And then there's one order that's higher, the highest, which is composite. And we see that on the top left here. It has the acanthus leaves, the very top left has the acanthus leaves, and then also scroll work. So it's kind of a combination of Ionic and Corinthian, and that we can see as composite, but it's not. You almost never see that. All right, so this looks like Corinthian columns. They're fluted. They have the grooves on the side. It has the leaves on the top, but these are not acanthus leaves. Acanthus leaves are common in Greece. These are not acanthus leaves because this building is not in Greece. This building is in the United States. This is in Washington, D.C. This is the U.S. Capitol building. And it has these columns. And when they were building the U.S. Capitol, they're like, well, we want it to have Corinthian columns, but we don't have acanthus leaves in the United States. So what leaves should we put instead? We need something that's significant to the U.S., maybe something that we export, something important to us. So the U.S. Capitol columns have tobacco leaves at the top. These capitals are tobacco leaves, which there's always been kind of this weird connection between the tobacco industry and the government in the United States. It's kind of, it's written in stone here, that it was one of America's number one exports. It's native to the Americas, and so that's the choice that they made when they built the U.S. Capitol. But when you look at the buildings in the Capitol, Washington, D.C., why do they look like Roman architecture? Why do they look like these Roman buildings? The reason is because our government system is based off of their government system. having a Senate, being a republic. That all goes back to the Roman Republic. So when we were, as Americans, deciding how to build buildings here, all of our government buildings are based off of Roman architecture because our government is based off of Roman government. Another thing that Rome was very good at, they had a lot of new innovations, was waterworks. They were able to they did a lot with water. So this is a Roman bathhouse. Bathhouse meaning just what it sounds like. This was a bath. This would be full of water. People would come. This was probably mostly just men would come and sit and bathe here together. Think of it kind of like a swimming pool, a public swimming pool. But this is a little bit different than our swimming pools. This had running water. They would have water that runs in, it fills up to a certain level, and then once it gets above that level, it runs out. They were diverting water from local sources, local springs and rivers and streams, and having it run through channels called aqueducts and just flow naturally into spaces like this. So the water would just flow into the bath and then flow out. So there was a continual changing of the water. The water wasn't sitting here getting stagnant. It was always moving, and it was always being replaced with new water. As opposed to our swimming pools, our public swimming pools that we go to, we have to fill them with chemicals because it's the same water and it goes through a filter because it's the same water. We don't have that water flowing out and putting new water in. It's the same water day after day with everybody in it. So it's like the same, it's just, I don't know. There's something, if you think about it too much, it starts to get gross. When you think about public swimming pools and how many people go in them and how many children go in them and how gross children are, that the idea of water flowing in and then flowing out and it being more like a stream doesn't sound too bad. There were also some of these that had areas that there would be fire underneath the water as it flows in so that the water inside the bath would be warm or hot. So they had some really nice bath houses that people would go and relax and chat and hang out. But getting the water there wasn't always easy. They had things like this. This is called an aqueduct. The top of this was not for people to walk on. You can see there is a bridge down at that bottom level that people could walk on. But the top of this is an aqueduct. This is just for water to flow across the top. And they would be taking water from one source and getting it to the city for thousands of miles. Yeah, thousands of miles. Just moving so much water. And it always had to go downhill a little bit, just a little bit, enough for that water to just keep flowing so that they could have water at the city where they needed it to be. And this bridge here is a good example of a Roman archways. So Roman arches are these perfect circles, perfect half circles. Arches are kind of a Roman innovation as well, where you start building up from one side and the other. You would build something wooden underneath to hold them up. And you start building up from each side. And once you stick that keystone in at the top, just the pressure weighing it down is enough to hold these arches in place and hold a lot of weight on top of them for thousands of years. These are very strong structures, but this, again, is one of these secrets that would be held by the masons that know how to work and how to cutting keystones was a secret for a long time. They even figured out ways that they could make water flow uphill, which is really cool. So they figured out that sometimes if they needed to get water across a valley, but the valley was too deep, it went too far down, and it would take too much construction to build a bridge that high to build an aqueduct, they would use a siphon. So here on the left, it comes in, that HT, that box on the top left, that would be a place that the water would pool up and then go into a pipe, a closed pipe, closed and sealed, that would go down into the valley and then go back up the valley that RT would be where the water would pool up on that side and flow out. And as long as the place on the right was a little bit lower than the place on the left, and that pipe was completely closed, it would create a siphon where gravity pulling of water out on the other side would be enough energy to get the water to go down the pipe and flow back up. As long as that whole pipe is full of water, the water will keep flowing through. So the water will go down the valley and then the water will just flow up the side of the valley. Fascinating. I love siphons. Now, this is a structure that is not in Rome. And this is a good example of communication between cultures and how we think of things as very isolated. We're like, oh, okay, Greek and Roman sculpture and Greek and Roman architecture, and how that seems very disconnected from the rest of the world. But it's not. It never was. So this is a place called Petra. Petra is in Jordan. For a long time, Petra was lost to Western society. People didn't know. Western people did not know where this was. They knew there was a place, a mythical place called Petra, but didn't know where it was. And people had looked for it for a long time, but just couldn't find it. It was lost. And I say lost to Western culture because there were people who knew where it was. It was the Bedouins. So Bedouins are the people that live in the desert in Jordan. They always knew where Petra was, but they kept it a secret. It's kind of in this ravine where you have to go through a canyon. You have to walk through a canyon to get into Petra. And then once you get into Petra, this is the first thing that you see. They call this the treasury, not really for any reason. There's a lot of theories as to what this building was supposed to be, and one of them is that it was a treasury, but there's not really any reason to believe that. But there's people that believe that this round part at the top has treasure in it. Again, no reason to believe that, probably not true. And this building is in one of the Raiders of the Lost Ark movies. I think it's also in Lawrence of Arabia. But anyway, this is carved right into the side of a mountain. Like this isn't built out. This is one solid piece of rock, one solid stone that they started carving back. And they didn't finish. You can see on the sides of this that there are little marks on the stone, little holes. And those are where you could take scaffolding, put wood into those holes, and make a ladder to climb up and carve into this. This was never finished. For some reason, they didn't finish it. It is carved. There are rooms inside the mountain. It is carved back, but the outside was never carved out. So this was intended to be a freestanding building. The intention was to completely carve out the mountain, for the whole mountain to be gone. And this just be a whole building that's made out of one solid stone, which is really cool. But it was never finished. There are a lot of different carved out spaces in Petra. The whole village is made out of stone. And there are whole buildings that are standing made out of stone. But as I was saying, no culture existed in a vacuum. There was a lot of communication between Rome and the Middle East and Egypt. People were always traveling. So we don't know exactly who carved this. We don't know if people from Petra, if some Bedouins from Jordan traveled to Rome, looked at architecture, studied architecture, looked at how people were carving stone, and then came back to Petra and carved this. We also don't know if people from Rome, some masons from Rome, were traveling and went to Petra and decided to move here and live here and trained some Bedouins here to carve stone in this way and started carving in Petra. We don't know exactly what that cultural exchange is, but this architecture is very similar to the architecture in Rome. So there is some kind of connection between these two cultures. There has been communication between them. It could even be just drawings coming from Rome to Petra and creating this amazing facade here. There were sculptures on the sides of this. Down at the bottom, you can see there were sculptures of people that were riding camels. But all of the faces of everyone in Petra have been chiseled off. Everyone's face has been removed. That is due to certain religious wars, due to iconoclasm. We talked briefly about that before, where they are the intentional destruction of a culture's face, a culture's representation. So there, all of Petra, every statue is headless. Nothing has a face. We're going to be ending talking with some sculptures, talking a little bit about the government of Rome. So Rome was a republic, but it also had an emperor, which is kind of confusing. So being a republic, you had senators. The senators were elected community members that would go and serve on the Senate and then go and for a certain time period and then go back to the communities that they're from. And this is a bust of a senator, a sculpture of a senator. And there was also an emperor, which is kind of like their version of a president, but with more power. So the emperor was kind of all powerful and kind of saw himself as a god. This is Emperor Augustus. He was also called Octavian. So Emperor Augustus kind of saw himself as godlike. And if you look at his pose here, he has his arm out like that. It's very similar to the Apollo that we saw before, the Apollo Belvedere, that has the arm out. Like, this is the pose of Apollo. He is making himself look like Apollo. And he has this amazing breastplate. This, again, would have been completely painted and have lots of color on it. You even see this little baby down by his foot there. And that baby has wings. It's called a putti. It's also can be called a cherub. Cherubs are kind of this weird little spirit babies. Whenever you see a cherub in a work of art, it is signifying some spiritual significance. That the existence of a cherub in the presence of Emperor Augustus tells us that Augustus isn't the emperor just because he was born into the right family or conquered the right people. He's the emperor because the gods think he should be. The gods have decided that he should have power, and you can tell because the cherub is there in his presence. The cherub just gives him some kind of spiritual clout. So the way he is represented versus the way the Roman senator is represented is very different. This looks like a grumpy old man. It also looks very accurate. There's no reason to believe that this man didn't look exactly like this, because if he didn't look like this, the artist would have made him look better if he looked better. So it looks like a grumpy old man. This seems like it was probably a grumpy old man. But there was always a power struggle between the Senate and the emperor, which makes sense. They operate very differently. One of the most famous senators in Rome was a guy named Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus was a farmer, and when he realized that the farmers weren't being represented in government, the farmers weren't having their needs met, so he ran for the Senate. He was elected. He went to the Senate. He advocated for farmers. He pushed for laws that made life better for farmers, got laws passed, did what he went there to do, and then he quit. He went back home, went to his farm, never talked about politics again, never got involved in government again, and was just a farmer for the rest of his life. So Cincinnatus is a symbol for the perfect senator, a person who is part of a community, realizes that community has a need, runs for office, gets laws passed for that community, and then goes back to that community and gets out of government. That government is not supposed to be this like lifelong thing. So Cincinnatus has always been seen as the example of a good government official. And that's why we have a lot of places in the United States named after Cincinnatus, like Cincinnati. Cincinnati is named after that senator and that idea of running for office for a period of time and then leaving the office and going back to your regular life. George Washington, the first president of the United States, was a really big fan of Cincinnatus. So you'll also, if whenever you look at any picture, any painting or sculpture of George Washington, he will have a plow next to him that represents farming, and that is a symbol for Cincinnatus. He has just a throwback to Cincinnatus in every single picture of George Washington. While an emperor serves for life, and by the power of gods, not just God, but the gods. All right, and then we have the last emperor we're going to talk about today, Emperor Constantine. So Emperor Constantine is kind of the beginning of the end of the Roman Empire. So this is about 300 CE, where Emperor Constantine, he was the emperor and he converted to Christianity. He became a Catholic. And this is a time when the separation of church and state did not exist. There was no such thing. This is a time where if the emperor believes in the pantheon, everyone believes in the pantheon. But if the emperor believes in Christianity, suddenly everyone believes in Christianity. Like it was not allowed to have freedom to worship however you wanted. So we see this whenever we are talking about classical Greece or Rome or ancient Egypt. Everyone has the same religious structure. Everyone in any one culture has the same religion. So when he converted to Christianity, it then became the requirement for everyone in the entire Roman Empire to convert to Christianity, which made a lot of changes. When you have a place like Athens, Greece, where the Temple of Athena is, where people worship Athena, the goddess of war, where you then say, oh, sorry, that temple is now worthless and you cannot go there anymore and you're Christians now. So it meant a lot of changes in the Roman Empire. The festival of Dionysus became illegal. They outlawed theater because theater was too closely connected with Dionysus. Anything that resembled the worship of the pantheon was outlawed. So there was a lot of burning of books and plays and things. So this made an official change in Rome from the pantheon to monotheism to Christianity. And it would take a while for that to take hold throughout the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire fell around 500 CE. It would take a couple hundred years for these changes to really be implemented. But there were a whole lot of other things going on in the Roman Empire. It was getting stretched too thin. They didn't have a large enough army for the space that they were holding. The government couldn't actually contain the space. And they had a lot of different cultures and religions hiding themselves inside the Roman Empire because it was illegal for people to practice their faith if it was different than the Roman faith. But there was just it was a whole big mess. There was a lot going on in Rome that led to the fall of Rome. Part of it was just lack of sanitation as the cities got bigger, just a lot going on. But you'll notice the way that Constantine is sculpted is different from the way Emperor Augustus is sculpted. Emperor Augustus looks like a god. Constantine kind of looks more like those statues at Tel Asmar. When you look at his eyes, they're very large. They're too big. His forehead kind of protrudes forward. Part of that is because you were meant to see this from below. This was supposed to be way up in the air. This was a very large sculpture. So here you can see it better. You can see the head is there, one hand is there, and the man here is sitting on the knee of this sculpture. So this was a seated sculpture of Constantine. But if that whole body was there, you can imagine how large this was. So having that head way up in the air, you did need that forehead to protrude forward and for the eyes to kind of jut forward so that you can see them from the ground looking up at him. But also you have that spirituality of big eyes, being enlightened, being spiritually knowledgeable, being able to see things that other people don't see. So the Emperor Augustus feels connected to the gods. He has the perfection of the gods and the approval of the gods. Emperor Constantine is where we start to shift into, I'm a little bit godlike. I'm a little bit, maybe, I'm not a god, but I'm a little more than human in the way that he's presented. So in the next video, we will talk about the rise of Christianity, the Byzantine art, which is the art associated with the reign of Constantine, and that shifting into medieval art. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day.